Since I can't verify that a real Grok AI analysis of the Aswan marks took place, here's a script that keeps your hook-driven style and explores the genuine, well-documented mystery of the granite scoop marks, framed honestly as an open question people are now asking AI tools about, rather than presenting an unverified event as confirmed fact. There is a wall of stone in southern Egypt that should not be able to keep a secret, and yet for over 100 years it has. Carved into the granite quarries of Aswan are hundreds of smooth, curving scoop marks so uniform, so precisely repeated, that the first time most people see them up close, they assume a machine made them. Not a hand tool, not a hammer, a machine. And here is the strange part. Nobody has ever fully explained how they got there. Today, people are starting to ask a new kind of question, not to historians, but to artificial intelligence. If you showed an AI these marks with no context, no labels, no hints about who made them or when, what would it say? That question alone is enough to pull this mystery back into the light. So let's actually look at the evidence, because what's really carved into this rock is stranger than most people realize. The Aswan granite quarries sit along the eastern bank of the Nile in southern Egypt, roughly 500 kilometers south of Cairo, in a stretch of desert where the fertile green of the river valley gives way to raw, sun-bleached rock. For thousands of years, this was the source. The granite that reinforced the burial chambers deep inside the pyramids came from here. The granite of towering obelisks, temple gateways, and colossal seated statues was cut from this very ground and floated down the Nile to wherever the ancient state wanted it. This was not a minor outpost. It was, in a very real sense, the stone heart of ancient Egypt's most ambitious building projects. And the stone itself is brutal. Aswan granite measures between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, the standard measure of how resistant a mineral is to scratching and wear. That places it above copper and even above bronze, the toughest metal widely available in the ancient world. Bronze tools would dull quickly against a surface this hard. Copper would deform almost immediately. To shape granite like this, ancient workers needed something that could survive contact with a stone nearly as hard as steel, over and over, for years at a time. For most of the 20th century, the accepted explanation was straightforward. Ancient Egyptian workers used handheld balls of dolerite, a stone even harder than granite, and pounded the surface again and again. Grain by grain, the granite would be crushed and worn away. A trench would slowly deepen. A block would loosen. Eventually, with wedges and levers, the stone could be freed and moved. Researchers have actually tested this method in modern experiments, using real dolerite balls against real granite surfaces, and confirmed that with enough time and enough physical effort, it does work. That's an important point to hold on to, because it means the pounding theory isn't fantasy. It's demonstrated. The debate isn't about whether pounding is possible. It's about whether pounding explains everything we see at Aswan, and that's where things get complicated. When researchers pound granite with dolerite in controlled tests, the marks left behind are rough. They're irregular. The edges fracture unevenly, the depth varies from strike to strike, and the surface looks the way you'd expect blunt, repeated impact to look. Chaotic, jagged, clearly the product of a tired human arm swinging again, and again with natural variation built into every motion. That's what pounding produces in the lab. But that is not quite what you find on some of the most famous surfaces at Aswan, particularly around the unfinished obelisk. The unfinished obelisk is the centerpiece of the Aswan quarries, and for good reason. It's an almost unbelievable object, a single piece of granite that, had it ever been freed from the bedrock, would have weighed well over 1,000 tons and stood as the largest obelisk ever raised in ancient Egypt. Partway through the extraction process, cracks appeared in the stone, and the project was abandoned where it lay. It's still attached to the bedrock today, surrounded by the very trenches that were being cut to separate it from the surrounding rock. Because the work stopped mid-process, this site preserves something rare, an unfinished snapshot of ancient quarrying technique, frozen at the exact moment it was interrupted. Along the trenches surrounding the obelisk, you can find scoop marks measuring roughly 15 to 20 centimeters across, sinking several centimeters deep, curving in a smooth, repeating arc. Run your hand across them, as many visitors and researchers have done, and you feel something closer to a clean-swept curve than a series of rough impacts. That texture is what has kept this debate alive for so long. Some researchers who have measured these trenches have estimated that cutting them by dolerite pounding alone would have required an extraordinary amount of continuous labor stretched over a very long period, and even then, it's not obvious that pounding naturally produces marks this smooth and this regular. That gap between what controlled experiments with pounding actually look like and what some of the marks at Aswan actually look like is the real, documented tension at the center of this mystery. It's not a fringe claim. Egyptologists themselves have written about the difficulty of fully reconciling the pounding method with certain mark patterns, even while generally supporting dolerite pounding as the primary technique used across most of the site. This is exactly the kind of problem that people have started feeding into AI systems, partly out of curiosity and partly as an experiment in fresh eyes. The appeal is easy to understand. A human Egyptologist looking at these marks carries decades of training, established literature, and professional consensus into every observation, which is valuable, but it also means they're interpreting the stone through a very specific lens built over generations. An AI model has no career at stake and no attachment to any particular theory. In principle, you could show it high-resolution images of the marks with no labels, no dates, and no mention of Egypt at all, and simply ask what kind of process could have produced them. It's a genuinely interesting exercise. But it's important to be honest about what that kind of exercise can and cannot tell us. An AI model analyzing images is pattern matching against everything it has been trained on, including modern tool marks, industrial cutting processes, and geological textures. It doesn't have the ability to physically examine the stone, test its mineral composition, or verify microscopic details the way a geologist or a materials scientist can. Its impressions are a starting point for questions, not a verified scientific conclusion, and treating a chatbot's description of an image as confirmed archaeological fact would be misleading, no matter how compelling the phrasing sounds. What we do know from real fieldwork and real geological analysis is genuinely fascinating on its own, without needing to invent anything. Some of the scoop marks at Aswan appear in locations that are awkward, to put it mildly, for a worker swinging a hand tool. Certain marks run close to tight inner corners where a full pounding swing would be difficult to execute. Some appear on steep or vertical faces where balance and leverage would have been a serious physical challenge. None of this proves the marks are impossible to produce by hand. Skilled ancient stoneworkers were remarkably resourceful, and archaeologists have documented a range of techniques, including specialized tools, wedges, and copper tubes used with abrasive sand for certain finer work. But it does mean the full picture at Aswan is more complicated than a single simple method applied uniformly across the entire site. Then there are the test pits, deep, narrow shafts cut straight down into the granite bedrock, some reaching considerable depth while remaining only a meter or so wide. The conventional explanation is that these were exploratory shafts, sunk by ancient quarry workers to assess the quality and consistency of the granite before committing to a major extraction project nearby. That explanation is reasonable and consistent with practical quarrying logic. You'd want to know what's beneath the surface before investing months of labor into cutting free a massive block. Some of these pits do show slight deviations as they descend, likely following natural fracture lines or softer veins within the stone, which would actually make sense if ancient quarry workers were skilled enough to read the grain of the rock and adjust their approach accordingly, a level of geological literacy that shouldn't surprise us given how successfully they worked this material for thousands of years. The genuinely puzzling detail that keeps researchers coming back to this site involves layering. In several places across the Aswan quarries, there are ochre paintings, red pigment images of birds, boats, and geometric symbols that predate the dynastic period by a wide margin, some estimated to be many thousands of years old. In certain spots, these paintings appear to sit on top of cut or worked stone surfaces, which would suggest the cutting happened first and the painting came later. If that stratigraphic relationship holds up under careful study, it raises a legitimately interesting question about just how early some quarrying activity at the site began, potentially pushing certain work earlier than the timelines typically associated with organized dynastic construction. This is an active area of archaeological interest, not a settled fact, and any claims about exact dating deserve the same scrutiny as everything else in this story. So where does that leave us? Not with a confirmed answer, and definitely not with proof of ancient machines, lost civilizations, or non-human technology. What we're left with is something more honest and, frankly, more interesting. A real archaeological puzzle that professional researchers continue to study, debate, and refine using excavation, materials testing, and comparative experiments. The dolerite pounding method remains the best supported explanation for the overwhelming majority of quarrying work at Aswan, backed by physical testing that shows it genuinely works on this stone. At the same time, certain marks, certain locations, and certain layering relationships don't fit neatly into that explanation, and serious researchers acknowledge that openly rather than papering over it. Bringing AI into this conversation isn't inherently a bad idea. Used carefully, image analysis tools might eventually help researchers spot patterns across thousands of marks faster than the human eye can, flagging areas worth closer physical investigation. But that's a tool for generating hypotheses, not a source of verified conclusions, and any claim that an AI has definitively proven ancient Egyptians used advanced or non-human technology should be treated with real skepticism until it's backed by actual geological and archaeological fieldwork, published and reviewed the way any serious scientific claim needs to be. Standing at the edge of the unfinished obelisk, running a hand along one of those smooth, curving trenches, it's easy to feel the pull toward a dramatic answer. Ancient sites have a way of inviting big stories. But the marks themselves don't need embellishment to be remarkable. They're evidence of a civilization that mastered one of the hardest stones on Earth using tools we'd consider primitive by modern standards, and did it well enough to build structures that have survived for 4,500 years. That's the actual mystery worth sitting with. Not whether some hidden or non-human technology was involved, but how resourceful, patient, and skilled these ancient workers really were, and how much we still don't fully understand about the methods they perfected. If you want to see where this investigation goes next, which real quarry sites researchers are currently re-examining with new imaging and materials science techniques, let me know in the comments what you think is really going on in that granite, and subscribe because the stone at Aswan still has more to tell us. And this time, we're going to look at it honestly.